You say that the first-hand experience is an alternative to a scientific model or medical model, whatever you want to call it. Do you see them as complementary? You know, I think that one criticism of the first-hand experience can be that you're breaking down all the scientific knowledge and evidence, and you know, that there's a danger that you're going to get into an infinite regress. How do you stand on that? Are they complementary, or can you sort of elaborate on that?
You know, that's a really excellent question, and let me digress for one moment and come right back to it. Because I think that word that you're using, complementary, is a very, very interesting one. And I don't know if you've been listening to the news in the last few days, but there's been a debate going on about homeopathy in the scientific world right now.
I don't quite mean it in that way.
Well, but I want to mention this because I think it's interesting to think about what complementary can mean. We call approaches like, in Western culture, we call approaches like homeopathy and acupuncture and so on, we call them complementary approaches. Sometimes we call them alternative and complementary. But that word complementary carries with it the idea that you could do both things at the same time, and they're not really in competition with one another. Now, I think if you really are a homeopath, you wouldn't actually take that point of view. Or if you practice acupuncture, you would say acupuncture is based on an entire system of thought which is different from the Western system. So, for instance, it's based on the idea of qi, energy in the body, and meridians that go through the different parts of the body. So in that system of thought, in Chinese medicine, for example, the organ systems that are the core parts of Western medicine are just not very relevant. It's the meridians that are the key part. So I bring this up because I think that sometimes we use a word like complementary. It's a nice word. It sounds great. Like, who wouldn't say, let's have more approaches rather than fewer? Great, let's have more. But what if the more contradict one another? Now I'm going to come back directly to your question, because I think here's where we need to address the real challenge of first-hand accounts. If a person's experience directly, and there are plenty of people who have this experience, is, for example, take the most obvious example, that a medication that they're given for their mental illness is helpful to them. And there are plenty of accounts in which people have talked about how a particular medication is helpful to them. If that's their experience, and they might have a slightly different experience of why they came to have these difficulties in the first place, like it might not be about genetics or chemical imbalances, it might be about something in their life, then I think it can be complementary with the medical model in the sense that what the person is doing with their lived experience is contributing some richness to the account. But I think if a person says, I don't have schizophrenia, I was sexually abused, I'm a trauma survivor. If I hear voices, it's because the voice of my abuser is coming back to me. That's not a complementary approach. In that case, that person is going to say, I don't want medication. I don't want CBT. I don't want any of these approaches that come from a model that says there's something wrong with me. Because that person would say, Jackie Dillon, the person I quoted earlier, who's the current national chair of the Hearing Voices Network, Jackie Dillon would say, don't ask what's wrong with me, ask what's happened to me. Now, if you take that approach toward your so-called symptoms, no medical approach is going to seem appropriate to you because, in your view, you don't have a pathology. You don't have schizophrenia. You don't have a mental illness. You're a trauma survivor, and what you need is to be, for example, in a peer support group with other trauma survivors so that you can work through what those difficulties are. Does that make sense? I think it really depends. And here's where, if I'm emphasizing lived experience, I mean the individual lived experience. There's nothing we can generalize about. in that sense. That's why I have a bibliography with 700 narratives on it, and probably the next edition will have 900 on them. They don't all agree with each other. That's the key thing. I mean, psychiatry has a very narrow set of ideas, and you either agree with them or you don't. And I think what I'm trying to talk about is something which is much more diverse.
My questions come from two thoughts. First is about what you said about Dylan's and May's idea about colonizing surface use experience. And also, I'm thinking also about recovery movement. You said that like surface user movement here is more progressive or more challenging to the status quo than US. But when people try to broaden ideas of recovery model into UK, people used to talk about how US or other countries have already taken the recovery ideas on board. So I'm just thinking like what really is happening about recovery movement in the US. I'm just wondering whether the recovery movement still in US still keep a close relation with the surface user movement, or whether some professionals have already colonized that ideas and turned into something else.
It's a fantastic question. And first of all, let me clarify, because I want to be clear about this. I would never say there is not an active service user movement in the US. There absolutely is. What I was saying is that the influence of the pharmaceutical industry and the nature of the healthcare system in the US makes it much harder in the US for that movement to be heard than is the case in the UK. There's a lot more collaboration in the UK. Here we are sitting, in a university environment in which approaches of a variety of kinds of people from a variety of kinds of backgrounds are being welcomed all together. I cannot think of a university in the US where that would be the case, where there would be a center like this. That's what I'm saying. There's a very active movement, and I would say in a sense, it's even more courageous for people to fight hard against the psychiatric system in the US because it's so hegemonic and because it's so hard for those voices to be heard. So that's the first thing. Now, the second part of your question is very, very insightful because, unfortunately, that's actually exactly what's happened. The notion of recovery, which of course comes from the activist service user, survivor, patient, whatever we want to call it, movement, and was originally a tremendous challenge to the hopeless attitude of the medical model that said if someone has a diagnosis of schizophrenia, that's it for them. They'll never get better. They can take this medication and it would manage their symptoms, but they've got an incurable brain disease and that's their unfortunate lot in life. The whole idea of recovery, which came directly from lived experience, was a huge challenge to that. But unfortunately, I have to say that, now, it's very hard to generalize about the US, an extraordinarily diverse country with 300 million people, so let me not do that. But I will say that there has been a lot of, let's call it, co-optation of that word recovery by people who do not have a very activist idea of what it could mean, and whose notion of what leads to recovery is a lot of medication, a lot of adherence to what it is that medical professionals are saying. And I think that's a real difficulty because on the one hand, of course we want people to be talking about recovery rather than incurable illness. But on the other hand, if their notion of recovery is do what we say and don't do anything different from that, then you'll have a chance for recovery. That's a very narrow view. Now, again, I don't want to generalize about the United States. There are a lot of exciting things that are happening in different places in the United States. But if you read the literature, say from the National Institutes of Mental Health, which is the government-sponsored research supporter for mental health, I'm sure that there is now a great deal of language about recovery in documents like that. Whether it means the same thing as people would mean who are really trying to argue that they can completely recover from something like schizophrenia and live a life that is indistinguishable from that of other people, which of course is what I believe. I'm not sure the National Institutes of Mental Health is quite there. And that's why as a provocative thing to read and to challenge people with, I like Dillon and May because I think that word colonizing, and again, in a place like Britain, it's an even more powerful word than it is in the US. That word really challenges us to think, what does it mean to tell a person that your language to describe their experience is better than theirs? That's the real challenge that comes from that.
Thanks. I'm an educational and child psychologist, and I just wonder what your views are in cases of, what would be described as depression in childhood and adolescence, where the narrative is one of despair, hopelessness, and an inability to give any account of what's sucked out your personality, your sense of who you are, your joy of living, your ability to contemplate, doing much more than staying in bed and crying.
And can I just ask, before you give up the microphone, are you suggesting that an experience of sadness like that is different in your sense of it in children and adolescents as compared to adults?
No, not really. I think it's a question of that there isn't a narrative, there isn't a story. There's a sense of being overwhelmed by a change that sometimes crept up on people who don't feel they can account for why their existence has been transformed, the person they were isn't visible anymore, the things that used to bring pleasure to their life don't. The talents they used to enjoy developing. I think I'm perhaps talking about, kind of high-achieving young people who haven't had anything that they would register as traumatic life events, and there needs to be some, perhaps, encouragement to engage with treatment options that might be helpful. So not an imposition, but a kind of perhaps forceful negotiation.
Well, I certainly think that a person who has deep feelings of sadness and doesn't know where they come from is an ideal candidate to be in psychotherapy. I mean, that's what psychotherapy is for, or any kind of counseling. It's to help someone who doesn't have a narrative develop one. That's the entire point. They also might be in a peer support group. They might be in a, depending on their age, a play therapy kind of a context, or some other kind of creative medium. Maybe they can't talk about it, but they could paint or do some other kind of thing to provide an account of their experiences. I think one of the things that I have a tremendous respect for, from having read hundreds of these first-person accounts and having talked to so many people, again, is the individuality of people's experiences and the need for all of us to take a patient approach, patient in that sense of quiet, cautious, willing to wait kind of approach. And I'll give you an example. One of the people that I talk about in my book, Agnes's Jacket, is a man I know in Massachusetts who had an experience much more severe than what you're talking about that psychiatrists would diagnose as catatonic. He got so overwhelmed, not only by sadness, but by, really we could say, nihilism, a sense of just being unable to imagine continuing to exist, that not only could he not do any of the things that had previously provided him with satisfaction, like going to work and seeing people and so on, he couldn't move. That's the sense in which he would be diagnosed as catatonic. He laid in bed for many, many, many hours at a time, and on many days, the most that he could do was roll over from one side to the next. He would have died had he not had friends who supported his wish not to be in a hospital and provided food for him. Otherwise, he would have died. He was completely incapable of doing anything for himself. And he was in this state for a very long period of time. And it was absolutely agonizing to him. And I describe, actually I quote from his own account at great length about what it was like for him. And the reason I'm able to quote from his account at great length is because after he fully recovered from this extraordinarily painful period of time, which lasted for almost 10 years. He wasn't in the catatonic state for 10 years, but he was in it for 5 years. After he fully recovered from that horrifying experience, he was very, very eager to talk about what it was like. This particular person was someone for whom poetry is a very powerful medium. He read poetry when he was able to lift his head and hold a book, and he wrote poetry when he was able to do that, and he did it later. And one of the things that I learned from this man, which I hope you'll read this chapter and have a sense of this, because it's really extraordinary, and the reason most of the chapter is just quotations from him is because he talked about his experience in such a crystalline and beautiful way, as someone who really has a poetic sensibility. What I learned from him is that during this period of time in which, had you looked at him from the outside, he would have so seemed like someone who had no story, who had no narrative. He could not speak. Actually, inside his mind, during that whole period of time, was a very elaborate narrative and a very complicated set of symbols and ideas. At one point he felt that his head was like a crystal, like a glass crystal. And the reason he wasn't moving was because he was sure it would break if he moved even an inch. Now, I've never had that particular experience, but I can immediately see that if you felt that way, it would be quite sensible not to move. It'd be really dangerous to move. That would be the last thing you'd want to do. So I'm just saying, this is a more extreme experience than most of us have had. But I learned something very, very important about it, that even a person who seems as if they have no narrative whatsoever actually does. Maybe they can't recount it at that time, but maybe they can recount it later. Maybe little tiny bits of it can come out. This particular man was extraordinarily fortunate to have friends who let him live in their house, who prepared meals for him, and who, whenever it was possible for him to get a word or two out, would listen to him. Even if, I'm sure, I haven't talked to his friends, but I'm sure his friends felt as if they weren't really quite sure what he was saying. I think that's very, very important to just always hold in mind. I think human beings, I don't really like generalizations very much, but I'll make this one. I think human beings are narrative creatures. I think that's just how we make sense of our existence. And if at a given moment we're too terrified, or we're too paralyzed, or we're in an extremely strange state that we can't figure out how to make our way to other people, and we can't really provide an account for what's happening, ultimately we can, and we will, because we don't have any other choice, because that's how our minds work. That's what we'll do for ourselves, not only to reconnect with other people, but to make sense of our own experience. So to go back to your specific question, a person who feels sad and doesn't have any account of how come they're like that has to be able, in a supportive environment, either with other peers or with a psychotherapist or counselor, to say something about what that feels like. Even if all they're talking about over and over again is emptiness, blankness, nothingness, no story, nothing to say, start there. Start there.